Welcome this afternoon. My name is Hans Luger. I'm sharing the session on climate change, global emergency, and climate mobilization. Our two guests today are Rupert Read from the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England, and Tom Athanasiou from Berkeley, California, direct chair of the Eco Equity think tank. Both are authors in the field. Rupert has just published a book and with an important essay by him, by his think tank called Facing Up to Climate Reality, Honesty, Disaster and Hope. I'll pass this around for you to have a look at it. And Tom is in the process of publishing a book with the title everybody knows, Climate Emergency and the New Age of Inequality. We have a discussion today. The event is sponsored by the Institute of European Studies and in part financed by the William and Trudy Auswahl Fund in Philosophy. So let's start with Rupert and then go to Tom to respond.
Thanks, Hans. Yeah, so why don't you send that on its way around the room and people can check it out. Thank you all so much for coming this afternoon for this debate on what I hope is obvious is a hugely important topic. We're calling it a debate. I suspect it'll be more of mostly a friendly discussion. Tom and I are in many ways complete allies, and there's a lot of common ground between us. In particular, I think it's absolutely common ground between us that we desperately need a worldwide emergency climate mobilization, which the Green New Deal, which is currently being talked about in this country and now also more in my country, would be only the barest start of, really. The Green New Deal, it's fine as far as it goes, but what we actually need would go a lot further and deeper. Also, it would be not conceived of in the kind of Keynesian manner economically that the Green New Deal is conceived of in. What I mean by that is that we actually need to be looking to a world which is a post-growth world, where we're not trying constantly to keep on expanding the amount of economic activity and material throughput in the economy, because that ultimately is the root of the very crisis that we are in. And furthermore, if you have a Green New Deal which is operated as a would-be kind of Keynesian project for continuing to grow the economy, what you also get is what's technically called the rebound effect, which basically means that even while you're trying to go greener, there's a danger that you're going to actually encourage more use of the very materials which you wish to be getting away from. Because a simple way to think about it is something like this. Imagine that you save quite a lot of money by having insulation put into your roof in your house. If you're free to use your money in whichever way you want in an open free market growthist economy, then you might well choose to do something like use that spare money to go off on more holidays abroad by air, and you can quickly see the problem there. We need to have a Green New Deal in an overall context of post-growth and a fundamentally transformed way of organizing the economy and society. But, and here's where I think we'll start to see differences between what Tom believes and what I believe. I think it's very important to acknowledge that we can no longer pretend that the kind of worldwide emergency climate mobilization that we need, which the Green New Deal would just be the start of, as I say, I think we're in a world where we can no longer pretend that that's likely to happen and likely to be successful. To very briefly explain why, let me say something about the Paris Climate Change Accords, which are of course our great white hope, as it were, in terms of what's supposed to be happening worldwide to get us onto the right track climate-wise. The Paris Accord is supposed to be keeping us to 2 degrees of global overheat, but because its own targets were already inadequate, because it's a voluntary agreement, and because the voluntary contributions that countries have signed up to don't add up to enough to make its own targets, and because virtually every country in the world has plans which are incompatible with those planned voluntary contributions. I mean, virtually every country in the world still has plans for enormous infrastructure expansion, for economic growth, for expansion of things like air travel, we actually need realistically to be thinking that tragically the world is currently on a course towards something like 4 degrees of global overheat, not 2. And of course, we now know furthermore that 2 degrees isn't enough anyway. We need to be aiming for 1.5 degrees, which is virtually impossible, especially since we've learnt recently that finally the UN has woken up to the desperate and deadly reality of feedbacks in the climate system, which have been basically ignored by UN and IPCC reports until just a few weeks ago, when they produced a report on the situation in the Arctic and finally acknowledged that the situation in the Arctic is absolutely desperate. And the Arctic is about the worst place in the world for such a desperate situation. What I mean is that we're starting to get feedbacks in the Arctic which are very dangerous indeed. We're starting to get a loss of Arctic albedo, as you no doubt are aware. What that means is the Arctic ice sheet is shrinking, and as it shrinks, more heat and light gets absorbed rather than being reflected back out again, and you get a vicious circle effect. That connects with the most terrifying feedback of all, the methane feedback. There's enormous amounts of methane buried under the Arctic, buried under the sea, buried in permafrost. And that methane now appears to be starting to be released. And as it gets released, it creates more warming, and then more ice melts and more permafrost melts and more methane gets released, and you see where that's likely to be going. And the important thing to understand about methane is that depending on how you calculate, it's somewhere between about 25 and 100 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So you put all that together, and as I say, it looks like we're heading this century for at least 4 degrees of global overheat, not a maximum of 1.5 degrees as we should be. And the difference between those two is pretty significant. It's the difference between the possibility that civilization as we know it would be able to continue and the overwhelming probability that it won't. In other words, what I'm saying is that if you make an objective calculation of the probabilities, or put it this way more mundanely, if you were a betting man, as we say in Britain, you would now have to bet on collapse as the likely trajectory of this civilization. The only way that that situation will change is if we face the unpleasant reality that I just described and then rebel against it, go on to some whole different page in terms of the kind of activism and commitment that we're willing to make. And I think here, for example, of the movement that I'm involved with, which is in America as well, but is strongest in Britain thus far, Extinction Rebellion, which is precisely saying that governments which are committing us to this appalling future of climate breakdown and collapse are no longer legitimate, and we should rebel against them non-violently. It's going to require something like a fairly rapid triumph for Extinction Rebellion to actually do enough to change our trajectory enough to take us away from the path towards collapse, which otherwise looks likely. But as I say, it would be reckless to bet on us successfully making that kind of great transformation. It would be about as reckless as betting on Gandhian methods defeating Hitler would have been in 1938-39. Not inconceivable, just a very rash thing to think is likely to work. So, while, as I say, I'm sure that it will be common ground between Tom and myself that we need a worldwide emergency climate mobilization beginning with and not restricted to a Green New Deal, we also need something else, which I'm not sure whether Tom will agree with. I suspect he may not. We need a kind of plan B that we run simultaneously with plan A. It's too late for prevention. It's too late for approaches which are centered exclusively or near exclusively on mitigation of the climate problem. We need to start taking seriously adaptation to the changing world that we are in, and that is going to change further and deteriorate further, probably a lot further. Remember, for example, crucially, that even if we stopped all emissions tomorrow, the climate situation would still carry on getting significantly worse for at least another generation because of the enormous time lags that are in the system. due to the longevity of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and due to the enormous amount of heat that is now stored in our oceans, especially. Yeah? This problem is not going away, and it's not going to be mitigated away unless conceivably there is a rapid, more or less revolutionary change, which could be due to something like Extinction Rebellion triumphing all over the place. But to bet on that, that's what I want to happen, that's what I'm trying to make happen. To bet on that would be a rash thing to do. So we need a plan B simultaneously. We need to take seriously adaptation. When I talk about adaptation, I don't mean the more or less pathetic, mundane things which go under the name of adaptation most of the time. Things like higher sea walls. We need to have a whole different concept of adaptation, a concept of adaptation which is fit for a world which is going to see climatic deterioration for a long time to come, which is compatible with continuing to give ourselves a shot at a mitigation-focused victory. So we need a form of adaptation which is not unlike, for example, building higher seawalls and building more flood defences, carbon intensive, but on the contrary is actually itself conducive to drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. And what that means is that we need what my think tank in this book calls transformative adaptation. We need adaptation which is simultaneously mitigative and carbon reductive, and we need adaptation which, rather than trying to enable us to perpetuate the doomed system that we have, moves us into a new world where the system that will take the place of this failing industrial growthist civilization, industrial growthist society, will be able to start to emerge. So that will mean things like much more localized society, much more localized, not exclusively rain-fed agriculture, and so forth. We need transformative adaptation. But even that isn't enough. We need what's being called deep adaptation as well. What is deep adaptation? So deep adaptation is adaptation that is premised on the hypothesis that collapse is likely. Deep adaptation makes the crisis that we're in psychologically real for us. Talking about it and beginning it, and that's what we need to do, shows how hard it is for us to soften the blow of the climate devastation that we've set in train. It's going to be very, very hard for us to adapt to what is coming. And the idea, as I say, the traditional idea of sort of shallow adaptation, that we can carry on perpetuating the way that we live now while building higher seawalls or what have you, that idea is completely implausible. When you start to think about what would be necessary to adapt to a radically changed climatic world and to society that is in the process of a kind of collapse, then you start to think seriously and realize seriously how hard it is for us to soften the blows that are coming. And deep adaptation prepares for what is overwhelmingly likely. Just a little side note here, which we can discuss if you wish, a philosophical point. When I talk about what's overwhelmingly likely and collapse being overwhelmingly likely, there's a sense in which this is bound to be misleading, because this is not something which you can, strictly speaking, assign probabilities to. I don't just mean that you can't assign numerical probabilities because you can't assign them with the exactitude of probability calculation in a casino or what have you. I mean that what happens depends upon us. It depends upon what we decide to do. It depends upon our agency, our commitment, our level of honesty, our degree of boldness, etc. And that is always a vital thing for us to remind ourselves of. So when I talk about collapse being overwhelmingly likely, that is, if you will, shorthand for the way I put it a few minutes ago, that if you were a betting person, you wouldn't bet on us succeeding, except perhaps in the sense in which you can regard your whole life and what you choose to invest yourself in terms of your resources and the meaning of your life as being a kind of bet. But if you were betting purely for financial gain, you wouldn't bet on us making it through this without some kind of collapse event. So let me finish by briefly saying something about what deep adaptation actually means. Deep adaptation, and this would also be an example of transformative adaptation, has centrally within it, that we need to radically change agriculture. We need to make agriculture far, far less dependent on fossil fuels, for example, not just because burning those fossil fuels is fatal to our future, but because we need to wake up to the likely reality that whether or not we wanted those fossil fuels, they are not going to be available to us in a society which is experiencing massive reduction of its length of supply chains, i.e. a society which is itself in the process of collapsing, or which is subject to other societies that it depends on being in the process of collapsing. And it's crucial that we change agriculture radically before, and for that matter during, any collapse event, so that we don't just get desperate and stop making any efforts to mitigate. You know, if you're absolutely desperate about where your next meal is coming from, you're not going to be caring very much about whether or not you burn coal in order to get that next meal. Yeah. Clear examples of deep adaptation that we need to be bending our wills to, putting resources into, and turning our minds to now include things like creating long-term viable seed banks that can survive climatic catastrophe and societal breakdown. You may be aware that, for example, tragically, the seed bank at Svalbard in the far north started to melt recently because of the unprecedented Arctic warming, showing the vulnerability of even the best laid plans of men and other beings. We need to be thinking about how to create seed banks that are more robust even than that. And the example I'd like to finish with, which is I think a very instructive one, we need to put a rapid end to and make safe nuclear power all over the world. Until recently, some people argued that nuclear power was a way in which we could help help ourselves through the climate crisis, because it's allegedly lower carbon than fossil-fueled power. But when you start to think about the likelihood of our society, or of some societies in the world, falling apart, then you quickly start to realize what a completely insane and absurd thing it is to be dependent upon nuclear power at such a time. To be dependent upon on power stations which are virtually all vulnerably located on coasts. Sea level rise, anyone? Power stations which are incredibly complex and require enormous continual inputs of power and human oversight. Remember what happened with just a short time of that not being present in Fukushima. Power stations which produce waste, especially spent fuel rods, that if it's not continually attended to and cooled, that's the main reason why nuclear power stations are located on the coast, so they can keep everything cool, will burn off the water that surrounds them and spontaneously ignite and burn toxically into the atmosphere for decades or indeed centuries. So imagine a world which is in the process of partial collapse, and all over the world you've got nuclear power stations melting down, nuclear waste, spent fuel burning dry, and then burning off into the atmosphere. It's absolutely insane at this moment in history to be creating more conventional nuclear power. And what we ought to be doing rapidly is moving to make safe as we can, existing nuclear waste, and making safe the nuclear power stations which are continually producing it. So that's a strong example of what deep adaptation means. That needs to be a priority that we move to now. So to sum up, mitigation, absolutely, far, far more than we have right now. But also adaptation, by which I mean transformative adaptation and deep adaptation. And a very final thought, I think that this agenda, an agenda which says, yeah, let's have an emergency climate mobilization for mitigation, but also for adaptation of these kinds, can be highly mobilizing, because it's an honest approach which leaves behind the pretenses which have been holding us back for too long that everything's going to be fine. And it liberates us from conventional assumptions also about what it's okay to do and not do. Once you realize that if you're a younger person in the room, there's no guarantee that you're going to get an old age pension, partly because in a collapsed society there are no old age pensions, and partly because you may not get to grow old anyway. then you're liberated from the conventional assumptions of a conventional career and so on and so forth to be able to consider engaging in precisely the kind of, for example, radical nonviolent direct action that we need if we're going to have any hope of attaining the kinds of transformative changes that I think both Tom and I earnestly and desperately hope are going to occur. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom?
Fantastic. Could you do me a favor, please, and put on my, touch the button that says slide. No, no, not on there. On the, yes.
Over there?
Yeah. Touch the button upper right. So,
Which one?
yeah, so my name is Tom Athanasiou, and whenever I go hear anybody talk, yeah, I think that should do it. Whenever I go to hear anybody talk, I always, size them up, because that's how I tell whether or not I'm going to decide to take them seriously or not. So you need to know who I am. And very briefly, what I want to say is that this is my calling card, I guess. What I want to say is that I ran the Equity Working Group in the International Climate Action Network between Copenhagen and Paris. I've been to more climate summits than I care to admit, okay? And I'm currently working with the U.S. Climate Action Network as the co-chair of the Global Responsibility Working Group. I have a very internationalist perspective, and that's who I am. My elevator rap, when somebody asks me what I do, is I say, I really am interested only in one thing, one question, which is what would be fair enough to actually work, okay? And it's a very difficult question. I commend it to your attention. The slide I'm showing you is, I agree with many of the things that Rupert said, including the fact that we agree about a lot of things, though we don't agree about everything. And one of the things we don't agree about is the precision with which we know our predicament. We actually know it quite precisely. This slide is the most terrifying image I have ever seen. It was from a paper that was published last year by Stefan et al. In the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The paper is called Trajectories of the Earth System in the Anthropocene. And what it shows you is that there are basically two pathways forward from here. One is called the stabilized Earth pathway, and the other one is called the hothouse Earth pathway. And that the science has gotten beyond vague talk of tipping points. And what the concept that you now have to imprint on your brain is tipping cascades, where tipping points interact with each other in such a way as to become completely unmanageable. And the tipping cascades appear to become probable around 2 degrees centigrade, okay? So that's the first thing to know. The second thing to know is that the 1.5 degree target has been very, very strongly debated within the climate movement. And when I say climate movement, I'm including the philosophers, I'm including the scientists, I'm including the diplomats, and I'm including the street activists. We're all part of the movement as far as I'm concerned, right? And the truth of the matter is that the reason why we're going for 1.5 is because it's our only chance of hitting 2. Right? We basically have to do everything. And if we're very smart and very lucky, we will achieve the Paris target, which is perfectly stated, to keep the warming well below 2 degrees and while trying to achieve 1.5. If Rupert's prediction that we hit 4 degrees centigrade comes true, which could easily happen if we go to 1.5 and happen to stumble into tipping cascades, there will be no deep adaptation. There will be global war it will be over, and really the best solution will be red wine. The best way forward will be an adaptation strategy based on red wine, okay? So that's what I wanted to show you. We know quite well where we are at now. The Paris targets are absolutely correct, and they are biophysically achievable. Rupert, this is something that I agree with Rupert about. The uncertainty is a multiple of the biophysical and socio-political uncertainties. The biophysical truth of the matter is that 2 degrees is still achievable. In fact, the IPCC in its last report argued quite convincingly, as far as I'm concerned, that 1.5 is still biophysically achievable, though in the language of the IPCC, this would require social changes of a scope and scale that has no plausible historical precedent, right? So what we're trying to do is hold the 2 degree line. The 4 degree figure, which I'm guessing Rupert got from Kevin Anderson, because he loves to tell the story of 2 degrees and 4 degrees. There is no 4 degree world if the new science is correct. We hit 2.5, maybe 2.7, we slide into the Cascades, and then the hand of God takes us to 7, or something like that. But the point is that it is still biophysically possible to stabilize the climate system. So everything now is about politics. Everything is, when you do anything, whichever part of the climate movement you're in, there's only one question about what you're doing. Is it helpful or is it unhelpful? Okay? So the question I have to ask as a debater with Rupert Read is whether his analysis is helpful. I think it is not helpful. Okay? The reason I think it is not helpful is because I think what we need is a positive transition story that we actually believe. An honest, compelling transition story that we actually believe. It is absolutely true that it's time for honesty. And many people are agreeing with this. The Wallace Wells book, on The Uninhabitable Earth, was a huge hit precisely because he's setting out to tell the truth. He gets a lot of things wrong, but not on the science side, on the politics side. Okay? So it's very important to think clearly about these things. Has the IPCC been soft-pedaling the truth? No, it has not. But the real thing I want to talk about is Paris. And is Paris a failure? No, Paris was not a failure. Paris did what it was designed to do. Paris was a success. When you say we need something like the Green New Deal, but much bigger, how my poor little brain translates that is that we need Green New Deals everywhere in the world, and we need them in the context of a cooperative global regime that places them in synergistic relationship to each other and gets us onto a virtuous transition path, right? It is very difficult for me, having spent as much time as I did on Paris, to hear criticisms of Paris that do not seem to understand the key thing about Paris, which is that it establishes an ambition ratchet which is absolutely in the control of the national governments. If we had mobilizations at the national level, the international dynamics that can take place within the Paris framework would be extremely different from the ones that we're seeing today. It is and so that's really, it's a little hard for me to listen to criticisms of Paris that don't understand what Paris was designed to do and why it's architected to do exactly that. Having said that, what's the summary of my position? The summary of my position is that we only need two things to save human civilization. Two. We need a thoroughgoing green technology revolution. And guess what? It's showing up everywhere. And one of the big problems now is taking everybody's attention from the first thing to the second thing, because the second thing is a high cooperation world, right? And the first thing I want to say about a high cooperation world is that you're not going to be able to imagine it within a completely localist vision of the transition in which activists are simply engaging with collapse dynamics which are encapsulated within their own domestic territories. We need a high cooperation world, planetary boundaries. Remember, planetary boundaries. We're all in this together. It's a global commonwealth, blah, blah, blah. The problem is, as Naomi Klein has pointed out so cogently, that the passion of neoliberal capitalism occurred essentially at the same time as the climate crisis reached its peak, right? And so we've inherited this poisonous market first model of globalization, and everybody's rebelling against it for jolly good reasons, right? And so we somehow have to invent, in a very short period of time, an alternative model of globalization. But I put it to you that we haven't got a possibility of success unless we put economic justice at the center of the climate agenda, and not just within countries. Economic justice globally. One of the great things about spending 15 years in the climate negotiations is you meet a lot of people from other parts of the world, right? And believe me, people are in different circumstances. Even nuclear power looks different if you're Chinese. This is an international studies department. You know, I think you understand the point. Having said all that, a couple of more specific comments. I do think Rupert's work is a step forward from some of the other dark ecology that has come out of England in particular. I think the Dark Mountain Project is terrifying. I think Rupert does deal with the inequality issue, the inequity issues, though he does not spotlight them. As far as I can tell, he doesn't deal at all with international justice, but which is the keystone issue. I mean, why were the international climate negotiations deadlocked for 30 years? Because of the dynamics of the global South and the global North, right? I mean, there's really two games. If you use game theory perspective here, there's two games going on. One is the zero-sum game against the fossil cartel, which must be destroyed. And then there's the non-zero-sum game of managing the global commons, which is the keystone problem of global equity. What else do I want to say? The Global New Deal, the Green New Deal. Okay, the Green New Deal has got everybody excited for very good reasons. Okay, I'm going through this very quickly, so I don't want to start enumerating the reason why the Green New Deal has been. But I think everybody's got their own theory about this, right? Everybody's reading it. We all know what's going on. It's Keynesianism. It's Keynesian. Yeah, it's Keynesian. You know, I was in a web strategy meeting 2 days ago with some of the architects of the Green New Deal from a group called New Consensus. It's unabashedly Keynesian, right? And that's why they think it will allow us to make an end run around the Republican extinctionists, the exterminists of the right, right? That because what we really need is progressive taxation and massive investment programs in the context of a mobilization designed as per the Paris ambition mechanisms to turn the crank very, very quickly and shut down the fossil cartel. You know, we're in this is at one level a very difficult problem of capitalism run amok. You know, there was a study that just was released by a group of NGO research groups just 2 or 3 days ago about the private banks, which have underwritten $1.8 trillion worth of fossil capital since Paris. You know, why is action so slow, right? Why have we lost control of our governments? Why is democracy in crisis? These are the questions if you want to win. If you want to stabilize the world, you have to think in terms of geoeconomics and geopolitics, and you have to think about taking power in Washington. I want to say one thing about what the IPCC actually said. They said we need net zero by 2050 to have a median chance of 1.5. They said 2 will be much, much worse than 1.5. They said 1.5 is still achievable, though it would require social changes that have no historical precedent. It gave an analysis of go back and look at the SPM again. The summary for policymakers. The P1 scenario is based on something called the low energy demand scenario. The only way 1.5 is achievable is if you reduce energy demand. The rebound effects that Rupert mentioned are our enemies. Is it possible to get around the rebound effects? Yes, it is, but not in a world where 1% of the global population controls 90% of the wealth. Not in a world in which a tremendous amount of the fluid capital on the planet is in tax havens, right? I mean, these fundamental questions of international justice need to be spotlighted. The real truth, and I will end with this, the real truth is that we are not doomed. To be doomed is to be fated to death. That's what it means to be doomed. The tragedy that it looks like we're going through is exactly the tragedy of not being doomed. It's the tragedy of being able to save our civilization and probably not gonna do it. Right? That's much worse than being doomed. Right?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
We can save human civilization. We have the money, we have the science, we have the tech, we have the institutions. There's ideas coming out of the walls. If you had $1 for every good idea, you could retire, right? It's that we can't. We're politically deadlocked. We're unable to move. And the only way forward is with a justice-first strategy. I'm not talking about a strategy like deep adaptation that pays a little lip service to equity. I'm talking about justice first, right? This is exactly the strategy that they're taking with the Green New Deal. And it's got everybody mobilized. Honesty gets people mobilized, but also a sense that people are proposing an alternative on the actual scale of the problem is right. And personally, I don't think deep adaptation is a good idea because A, I don't think it will work, and B, I think it takes the space that should be going into a much more political vision, a much more strategic vision, a much more internationalist vision about global transformation under emergency circumstances. So I'm going to just leave it at that.
Rupert, you want to reply?
Yeah, so we'll have another short go each,
Yeah.
and then we'll
Okay.
open it up.
Okay.
I'm so glad we're having this discussion. I think it's exactly the right thing to be doing, and yeah, it's really energizing, and it's great to see the places where we agree, and it's great to see to try to get clear on where we don't agree. I want to say thank you for noticing the important differences between my perspective and that of Dark Mountain. I do respect the Dark Mountain people very much, and I think in some ways they've been visionaries. But I think that something which is problematic about the Dark Mountain approach, and it's also problematic about the approach taken by my friend and colleague Jem Bendell, who created the Deep Adaptation Framework, is that they do all give the impression that we are doomed. And I think that you and I are actually quite close in thinking we're not doomed, and the tragedy is that it's even worse, therefore, to be not doomed and to be probably about to fuck it all up. I do, as you've said, I do disagree about how precisely we know our predicament. For me, the precautionary principle is central here, and it's partly because of the precautionary principle, which is a way of trying to find your way around a world which you accept that you're never going to fully understand. It's partly for that reason that I believe that we need to run the Plan B of deep adaptation alongside the Plan A of vast emergency mitigatory centric climate mobilization. I do think that it's clear that the IPC has been soft-pedaling the truth, right up until and including the 1.5 degree report. I think that the recent Arctic report makes that clear. The 1.5 degree report basically did not include feedbacks, and that is completely absurd and reprehensible at this moment in history. And it's pretty much this moment. It's just several months ago still, the 1.5 degree report. A useful source here is the Climate Code Red report, What Lies Beneath, which systematically shows the way that most climate scientists, including the UN processes, have soft-pedaled the truth for a long time. Look, Tom, I want to stabilize the world. I want to stabilize just as much as you do, but part of my point is wants are not the same thing as realities. You ask, is my approach helpful or unhelpful? Well, I have to ask to what? I mean, if the objective is for us all to be able to carry on believing, or I would say pretending, that we can rationally bet on winning with Plan A only, then I say that that is an unhelpful objective. You say, well, we need a compelling transition story that we actually believe. But in a world where we have Bolsonaro in charge in Brazil, in a world where we have far more ocean warming than we had realized a few years ago, in a world where the weather has been spinning out of control since Paris, in a world where we are now become clearer about the feedbacks that are emerging in the Arctic, with what degree of confidence can we believe this compelling transition story? I'm quite prepared to believe it in the sense of willing it to be true. It's a little bit like believing in God, right? It's not the same thing as believing in something which you can rationally, objectively be confident of. If I gave the wrong impression in terms of what I think about Paris, I apologize. But Paris was an incredible diplomatic achievement. I'm totally in favor of the ambition ratchet that's, as you say, absolutely central to Paris. I wasn't attacking the agreement as such. What I was saying is that we have pretty good reason to believe that it's not going to save us. Yeah, sure, we need a high cooperation world, and we ought to aim for that world, but we also need to be realistic, and we need to accept that far more localization is desirable and in fact inevitable. That doesn't mean there can't be international cooperation. What it means is that it's desirable and inevitable. I agree with you that equity is survival, but I'm skeptical about the way in which you try to place economic justice absolutely up front in the climate struggle. For this reason, my nervousness about your wonderful, innovative greenhouse development rights method for achieving climate justice is that it basically tries to create a sort of giant worldwide social security system which is run through something like the UN. And I want to say we can't. I don't think it's plausible to think that we in the world, certainly in a world which includes people like Trump and Bolsonaro and Putin and the Gulf states, that are we really gonna sort all of the world's problems of justice and poverty out through the metric of climate? I think that just kind of adds another rod to our back. Finally, you say that the Green New Deal is unabashedly Keynesian and that's why it might win. And I just repeat that if it stays that way, that just shows why it won't save us. Because it will be bought into further industrial growth expansion, and it will create a stronger rebound effect. If what the result of all this is that collapse is, as I think we both think, actually, pretty damn likely, then you say, look, deep adaptation isn't going to help because if we go down the hothouse Earth route, then we're just going to end up with some kind of utter terminal collapse, and you can't even talk about deep adaptation in that circumstance. But I think it's really important to try to understand that deep adaptation is not just a kind of set of sort of policy interventions. It's a whole new way of thinking about the situation and of trying to adjust ourselves to the painful new realities which we're starting to find our place in. I think that viewed in that way, it doesn't take the space of, as you claimed it did, it doesn't take the space of an emergency climate mobilization, but I think it is a necessary adjunct to it. And I think if you try to carry on putting all your eggs in the basket of an economic justice-centric, mitigation-centric attempt to achieve the stabilization of the world's climate that we both earnestly desire, then actually you're taking up some of the space which needs to go into grieving for what we've lost and for what we're going to be losing and adjusting to some of the painful realities of what's almost certainly coming down the pike at us. There is an enormous mental health crisis coming to our world. You think we've got a mental health epidemic in our society, you ain't seen nothing yet. When more people wake up to the degradation that we've created for our ecological systems and so on, it doesn't help to lessen the coming impact of that mental health pandemic to try to stop us thinking now about how we need to change both our policies and our psyches to adjust to the likelihood that the insurance policy of deep adaptation is going to be needed.
Okay, good. Just a couple of points, and then hopefully other people will have some incisive and interesting comments. On the IPCC, you need to understand that it's extremely political, and you have to get the summaries past the governments. There were big fights around the SPM on the special report for 1.5. Some quite dramatic ones, and I personally thought that the authors were brilliant in terms of what they fit into that report. And I will point out to people that there's a tremendous amount of equity in the special report on 1.5. It's really kind of amazing. The IPCC, as far as I'm concerned, is getting much more frank about political economy and about the injustice problem than they have ever been before. The other thing I want to say about the IPCC is that there are 2 more special reports coming out this year, and one of them is on the ice, and it's coming out in August, I think, or September, and so we'll see. We'll see if the feedbacks are in it, right? My understanding is that you've talked a terrific amount about the methane time bomb, and that the scientists have decided we have much more time on that front than we thought. So you know, one thing I would say to you is don't bend over backwards to make it worse than it is. You don't need to do that in order to make your case. Your case is strong, right? And this is bad enough. This will totally support your case, right? On the equity first question and whether equity is actually an impediment to ambition, this is something I could talk about for a week. It's been basically my life for 10 years as an equity activist within the international climate movement, and all I can say is maybe the realists who thought that we should keep the equity challenge of the climate transition out of the spotlight were correct before Paris, but they're not correct now. Paris is banked. It has been landed, except for Article 6, because of Bolsonaro, on the future of market instruments. That's the only part of the rule book that hasn't more or less been laid down. The battles are now national battles, and the challenge is to make national and local battles internationalist, right? So I would say that if you think we can have a deep adaptation movement that still takes international justice, and for that matter domestic economic justice, seriously, show me, because I haven't seen it yet. Your work is the only product of the dark ecology movement that I've ever seen that even talks about equity, and again, it comes off as an afterthought. So on the question of an international climate regime being a giant worldwide social security system, I would only say that the mitigation side of the problem is easy. The adaptation side of the problem is hard. Very, very hard. One of the key points that Wallace Wells makes in The Uninhabitable Earth is that it is likely that by mid-century, a large part of the equatorial belt will be uninhabitable or becoming uninhabitable. And we've all seen how the migration crisis has fed the right. The migration crisis that we see now is as nothing compared to the migration crisis we are going to see within the lifetimes of our children. How do we think about this in a way that is not immediately borged into the right-wing nationalist storyline? That's the challenge, right? And it's how do we think like a planet? How do we imagine that we're in this together? It has to be a justice first perspective. There is absolutely no way the poor regions of the world can afford to decarbonize at the necessary speed without a tremendous amount of assistance. And if we need global Keynesian mechanisms to print the money so that coal can be phased out very, very rapidly throughout the world, let there be Keynesian mechanisms. And the other thing I want to say about growth is that growth is the worst and most confusionist abstraction that we have ever had to engage in. Can we just stop using the word? It confounds people because it simultaneously denotes an increase in energy and material flows and increased numbers on the charts, which are stock markets, right? We don't care what those numbers are. We care about reducing the energy and material flows. And so there is no future in which we don't unlink the numbers from the energy and material flows. There is no way we're going to do that in a world as extremely, as sharply polarized as this world. The thing you have to understand about extreme inequality is it is a social poison. It kills everything. It kills democracy, it kills cooperation, both local and international. If there is a high inequality, deep adaptation storyline, you don't want to be there. It will be terrible. Okay? Wolfgang Sachs, who used to be a big man around this campus, but who's now quite ill, when I saw him last year, said that what he's concerned about now is there a possibility of what he called cosmopolitan nationalism. And I think that, are we going to be able to invent cosmopolitan nationalism, and for that matter, cosmopolitan localism, in the context of a global emergency mobilization? So these are questions, they're not answers, right?
I suggest that Tom and I now sit out until the end. We get to come back at
Okay,
the end. People get to say things and ask questions, and we'll answer any questions at the end.
I have a couple things. I think that I like, Rupert, what you're saying, that we need a plan A and plan B that need to happen at the same time. And I think that this is like what you both are talking about. The revolution that you're talking about is exactly what Extinction Rebellion is. We need people outside protesting, and we need politicians to be working with the system that we have in order to change it. So I don't think that it's necessarily not compatible. I think that they both need to work together, and the radical change that needs to happen in a global political society, we've been trying to do that for every single comp that we've had, and I don't think it's working. And I think that we do need more rebellion stuff to get the ball rolling. Also, in terms of is it feasible to stay at 2 degrees, one of the things that I don't see mentioned in these reports is what is already in the pipeline. Like, we know for a fact that at least 0.5 degrees is already baked into the system because of the
It
delay
is in the
across
models.
Oh, okay. Well,
It is in the model. I'm just
I
telling
didn't
you.
read the fine print, but either way, it doesn't.
No, it is in the models. The numbers that are being read out in the IPCC report takes account of the locked-in.
But so the new report, I guess I just have to look it up. But I know that that includes geoengineering in a lot of those trajectories.
Not in the temperature projections.
No, but geoengineering is included in the very strongly in the Paris Agreement. It is basically required for us for it to work across this century, and that's another catastrophe that I haven't even spoken about.
Where is geoengineering?
You know that it's there. It's there in virtually every scenario.
Yeah, I think that the only one that doesn't really consider it is the most extreme one, which we know that's business as usual. But,
Yeah, I didn't even talk about that. I've talked about that in longer speeches I've given elsewhere. I think that's a whole nother disastrous aspect of Paris. So that is something in Paris that I do think is really, really bad, especially because it's kind of hidden.
I'll go next.
Yeah, I was quite troubled by Tom, your support for the Green New Deal. It's there's a big hole in the whole thing, which is that it doesn't address the aspirations of the public, which is and our aspirations are for more growth. And there has to be a way to deal with that. And both of you were quite interesting, and I'm glad I came.
Yeah, Kathy and I have been working on these climate emergency declarations here in the Bay Area. We did the first one in Berkeley with my mother, who's on the Berkeley City Council, and then now there's like 8 cities who have passed them. Some which call for like a global effort, some which don't, depending on the comfortability of the elected officials and the people trying to get them passed. And locally, there's several struggles. One is politics, like who gets credit for passing it and whose leadership will lead it. A lot of like really petty, typical stuff. And then like here in the Bay Area, we have this initiative running where we pitched last year in August at the Bay Area, which has 9 counties surrounding the Bay, like simultaneously prototype a mass mobilization response. So that's running right now. And we're planning for our next summit. But I've like discovered along the way a couple things, which one which I feel like is an under talked about dynamic in the environmental movement, which is the history of racism, colonization, and its like segregating cultural effects. Like as a person of color, like brown skin, I'm like in predominantly white spaces in the environmental scene, and the dynamics there are really toxic, and it like makes it hard to be there and hard to stay there. And so I really appreciate the justice first approach, and I've been having this debate within like the people I've been working with around whether we just need to like full speed ahead to zero emissions and have justice be a byproduct of people inhaling less poisoned air, or whether it needs to be a structural intervention on business as usual as a deeply exploitative, deeply unjust, incarcerating, murdering, kind of stealing of wealth that our society, especially here in the United States. And I think mostly the people I've seen, I guess I wonder those two camps, most of the people I see advocating for justice are people who are experiencing injustice and they're sympathizers, and then most of the people advocating for just a full-on zero emissions only approach, in my experience, are more like wealthy, kind of like European or white, culturally positioned people who don't have that primary concern because they're not being impacted by injustice as directly. So I see that conversation pretty split pretty evenly depending on your position in the society and what you're experiencing. And I know personally, politically, I'm going to be less excited about something that doesn't include, my long-standing benefit. And I feel like globally, it's a big issue. Like I was hearing that, I think it was Britain, didn't want to admit that slavery was a problem because then they would owe reparations or something like that on some international discussion around reparations. I feel like our ability to cooperate in order to pull off a climate mobilization that does X, Y, and Z is deeply hindered by the history of our global violence. And this positive narrative that's going to unify the world has to include, an acknowledgement of what we've been through together and what, losing face on that, in order to establish a planetary civilization that fits our planetary boundaries. And so I feel like politically the right wing is capitalizing on the erosion of the commons by stoking fear and stonewalling while they're simultaneously incapable of addressing these global issues. So I feel like they're really weak strategically in the fact that they actually can't solve the problems that they're trying to build their base around. They actually can't stop migration flows by building walls because, it's just going to intensify the problem. So I feel like the right wing internationally is really weak in that sense. They have an Achilles heel in the sense that they can't solve the problems that they're facing. And simultaneously, there's all these moderate progressives who, when push comes to shove, won't actually stand for justice or solidarity on a policy level or just in their own hearts and minds. And so I feel like, only a radical politic that is serious about justice has the capacity to, advocate for, I just don't see how, here in the Bay Area, there's a lot of people who present as progressive, but when push comes to shove, they'll collapse on helping out poor people or helping out brown people or helping out black people because they're wealthier residents will be I don't want, here in Berkeley, for example, I don't want to see poor people anywhere, rip up all the tents, just erase them. I just don't want to see them. That's what's happening here in Berkeley. And so globally, I feel like it's the same thing. As long as there's, fake progressives and a idea that we just have to push it really further left than I think people are talking about. Anyway, those are just some comments.
Yeah, so I wanted to sort of follow up to your comments and ask if either of you had any, ideas for political strategies to actually accomplish, even the most modest things that you're talking about. I know you ran, I think at least Rupert, you ran for Parliament a while back, and so you have probably some thoughts on that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I guess I have a similar question, which is huge, like here in California, a huge amount of action goes into getting climate policies passed at the state level that are good and move us forward in some directions around reducing emissions, and they're all very incremental. And they're not really grounded in this conversation about where are we at and what will it really take and what does real transformation look like. So I'm wondering if you have suggestions about how to keep moving forward incrementally and move more quickly toward the kind of transformational change that you're both talking about.
Yeah.
I think that reducing emissions is absolutely based in justice. So, for example, we know, the percentage of people who consume the most. If we want to have a world where we have the low emissions that we want, we basically need Amazon to not exist, and ExxonMobil, and Lyft, and Uber, and all these kind of services that we use. And it's not enough for an individual to say, well, I'm just gonna recycle, I'm not gonna, I'm gonna walk to work, all that stuff. Like I think that's the big myth that is actually holding us back. Because I think that once we get rid of those corporations, hopefully, then that wealth gap and that injustice, I think will actually start to happen. Because we know a lot of the history, like in Latin America with colonization, was based on wanting to extract resources, and so now we're seeing a lot of those migration issues resulting from basically the U.S. going and taking resources. So I think that if we are serious about doing that, those are the radical changes that we need. We need the corporations specifically, like ExxonMobil just needs to exist. We need to figure out other options. They're getting in the way of this green revolution that we need, and I think that because they make all the money and they control all the money, if they don't exist anymore, then there's going to be a different kind of wealth distribution that hopefully will be more widespread. But if we don't get rid of Amazon, if we don't use Lyft or Uber or anything, any delivery service, any of that stuff, if we don't do any of that, I think it's game over. And we're seeing just how quickly things are happening because of these feedbacks.
So I just want to acknowledge my heart is pounding as I'm deciding to speak here. I just want to throw a few things out. So when I was growing up, and my son's here, my 18-year-old son's here, so I feel, I just want to have a moment where to just acknowledge we're sitting here having this conversation, and there's lots of feelings, and I want to make space for those because growing up in the shadow of the bomb as a young person, it wasn't until I met Joanna when I was in my 20s, Joanna Macy, that there was, because I became an activist to try to stop nuclear weapons, and but there was never a place until I found Joanna's work that we were having a conversation about the grief and the outrage and the fear. And so that's going on, and me listening to the two of you. I mean, I think I want to believe you, Tom, and I believe Rupert. So but, and that's my whole life.
I'm probably in the same position.
Yeah, So this is my whole life. I have 5 children. As I said, my youngest is here, so I keep wanting to turn over and look over my shoulder because I'm wondering how this is landing. And Joanna and I know Armando, and so. So I first just want to say we're having this conversation, and this is so intense, and I want to scream and cry, and also I feel grateful to be talking about it, because Joanna and I spent a lot of time talking about this, just the two of us, but I didn't think there was anything scarier than nuclear until climate catastrophe comes along. And but what I want to say, I feel so grateful, Rupert, for you mentioning the fuel rods, which we should call them something more descriptive about what they are, like mini Hiroshimas, every single one of them. And so I, as somebody who's, you know, been arrested many times, spent a lot of my life doing civil disobedience against war and nuclear weapons, I want to have this conversation linking these things. You know, it's like when I go out to Livermore Labs every year, I'm the youngest person there every year, you know, and then I live in a community with a lot of young climate change activists who have no idea about, you know, the state that we're still on hair trigger alert with nuclear weapons. So, and then there's just endless war and militarism and how that's contributing, and I don't see that being factored in as one of, you know, maybe the biggest contributor to climate catastrophe. I don't hear anybody talking about that. So I just want to put, you know, our emotions, our emotional, our psychic, spiritual, emotional bodies in this room, and plead for whatever that we're doing, that there's this umbrella where we're linking all these issues and bringing them together under one in one place. So thank you for hearing me out.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I've heard unprecedented social change might hit 1.5, and I wonder if you endorse such a social change, even if it is going towards authoritarian, anti-democratic.
Yeah.
That's it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
let me ask one more question,
Yeah.
directed at Rupert. We know how difficult it is for any society to adopt any one long-term plan. This idea that we would have a plan A and a plan B strikes me as very unrealistic. I think we have to commit ourselves to one plan, or there will be no plan, I think.
Okay, well, shall I go first and then
go
you go
ahead.
last?
Yeah, you go. Since everybody believes you.
But they all want to believe you. So I'll start with that very last point. You could regard, I talked about plan A and plan B, that's just a kind of shorthand really. You could regard these as two integrated aspects of one overarching plan, and that's a sort of semantic way of dealing with your problem. You could one way which I briefly mentioned to think about deep adaptation is as a kind of insurance policy. And I think that isn't beyond the wit of a society to think we can be aiming at something, but we can also have an insurance policy for if we don't make it. I really think that is quite credible. Thanks to everyone for the responses, and it's really, really great stuff, and so important and heartening to hear a lot of this stuff. We focus in on a few things. So I guess in terms of some of the variety of things that have been talked about, I think we kind of need everything in a certain sense, right? So yeah, I'm still totally in favor of operating within the conventional electoral and political system, and I'm still doing it myself, for example. But what I think is that it would be very rash to assume at this point that doing most of those kinds of things is doing anything more than what Joanna has called holding actions, trying to stop things from getting worse. They're not the same thing as actually thinking it's going to be enough to get you where you need to be. And for that, as I've said, I think we need something like Extinction Rebellion. We need a true kind of step change in our ambition and seriousness and willingness to commit. And having low ambitions or succeeding slowly is simply failing. What should we be aiming at in political terms? I'll just mention that chapter 1 of this book is, in my opinion, one of the most important chapters. It's by my colleague Richard Douglas. And he suggests, and I think it's quite plausible, that what could potentially come out of a sort of post-growth, climate-centric alternative to our current trajectory would actually be a kind of hybrid of capitalism and socialism, where you would preserve a key role for markets, but they would be radically constrained within various kinds of limits and obviously within planetary boundaries. I think that's quite plausible, and one reason I'm mentioning that is because I think that actually, and here I disagree with Armando, and with Tom. I think that it's dangerous in this debate to overemphasize the centrality of the right-left divide as it's conventionally understood, and dangerous to overestimate how useful the concept of being progressive is. I think these things can actually be part of the problem rather than part of the solution. I think that what we need to do is recognize the extent to which right and left have historically completely had in common a kind of emphasis on productivism and consumerism, which has taken us into the disastrous path in which we find ourselves. I think we really need to radically question the concept of development in a way which Tom's framework doesn't. In terms of being in an alliance with minorities and so on and so forth, well, absolutely. But I want to be in an alliance that includes indigenous people and peasants who, in many cases, don't want development and regard our civilization as a problem rather than as a solution. And only if we're willing to do something as radical as that are we going to take up the challenge which the gentleman here raised of being able to challenge the desire for endless more stuff forever. And if we don't challenge that desire sooner or later, then it's just clear that we're bound to fail. I also think part of moving beyond a fixation of categories of left and right, and indeed of justice and injustice, is that we have to be seriously oriented towards the future and towards long-termism. And you can talk about justice for future generations and so on, but actually it seems to me that that's always a kind of metaphor, that really what we need with regard to future generations is an attitude of fundamental care and of love, which is something rather different and pushes us in a different direction. And finally, on your marvelous question and comments, yeah, absolutely. And one of the reasons why I think that the deep adaptation approach can be helpful, just as I think Joanna's approach is profoundly helpful, is because it clears a space for that kind of emotionality to be present and important. And that's something which I found very exciting about Extinction Rebellion, actually, which is Extinction Rebellion is doing that in a way that most previous social movements haven't. And again, as I said in my earlier remarks, I think there's something very liberating about this, potentially. Something very liberating about political speeches, for example, which mention the word love, or where the speaker is crying as they give the speech. And I've seen both things in Extinction Rebellion. And I think we need a lot of liberation from conventional models of social change if we're going to achieve the vast transformation, which would be the only way that we're now going to be able to stop the kind of collapse that we both want to stop.
You know, I was agreeing with you, Rupert, about everything, and then you started with this beyond left and right stuff. You know, it's just nonsense. We are in a capitalist social formation, and it's a particularly awful one, but it has a logic. We have to understand that logic and push against it. I kind of think that's what you meant when you basically said that the author of the first chapter was recommending an amalgamation of socialism and capitalism. I think what we used to call that was social democracy, and yes, we need social democracy. And we need global social democracy. And the reason we need it is because the only future for the socialist experiment is going to be the one in which we survive this century. And the clock is ticking, right? As Elizabeth Warren said, unregulated markets, this is exactly how she said it, unregulated markets are theft.
Nice.
That's what they are.
What did you say? Unregulated markets are
Theft. I really agree with Armando's point about transitional justice, which is that we have to understand how we got here. This is a huge debate internationally that has to do with historical responsibility. One of the many reasons Paris was a breakthrough was because it kind of finessed this question, finally, and said that all countries are in. There isn't a North and a South, but it did it without pretending there wasn't. It didn't resolve the question of historical responsibility, but transitional justice has ways. There's an idea of a toolkit, facing history without blame, but facing it and recognizing its consequences and dealing with the consequences going forward. I reiterate my point that it's got to be fairness forward. It's interesting to hear that people are more pessimistic than I am. I have to tell you, it is an act of will to be pessimistic, but I want a positive transitional storyline that I actually believe. And so I have to backcast. The way you do these things is the way the scenarios work, and this the way you imagine a future condition, one in which we've stabilized the climate system, and then you backcast and figure out how you got there. What are the critical branch points that have to be taken? On the planning question, I will say that one of the many good things that came out of the Paris Agreement was a process by which all countries are encouraged to do very, very ambitious climate plans for themselves. And if Paris was working, if the Martians hadn't taken over Washington and London, evidently, and if the nations were mobilizing, we would be seeing the long-term planning process have much more action behind it. But it's happening. It's actually happening. And in terms of international support and international financial transfers and stuff, if you're sitting in an underfunded planning ministry in Ethiopia, if you cannot assume that there is going to be actual support, both on the adaptation side and the mitigation side, you cannot do an ambitious national transition plan. These countries cannot do it without help. And any idea that there is going to be a 2-degree world without really robust mechanisms of international cooperation is just insane. To Jean, on the question of appetite, I'm going to tell you, when I get depressed, when I give up, it's because of the fact that a very strong case can be made that human appetite is essentially infinite, and that infinite, and that we will not be able to discipline our own appetites. I do not believe that during the day. Sometimes at 3 o'clock in the morning I believe that, but during the day I believe that we can discipline our appetites, that we can want different things than the things that we currently want. We're not going to get rid of Amazon in time to stabilize the climate system, but we might regulate the shit out of it, right? But will we be able to pass those regulations in a world where everybody loves Amazon, in part because it's cheaper, like Walmart, and because they're scraping the floor. They cannot. The yellow vests. Remember the yellow vests? You worry about the end of the world. We worry about the end of the month. Right? This is if people do not believe that the climate movement is fundamentally respectful of the fact that many people are anxious about the end of the month, it's got nowhere to go. I'll stop right there.
So we have reached the end of our time. Well, let's thank our two discussants for a profound.
Okay.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, that was good.
That's good.
Very good.
Thanks, Hans.
Okay. See, we should bring back debates.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
we
we
should
have.
do-
We just did.
Yeah. Debates.
Next time I suggest red wine.
Yeah.
Well, now. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, you know that.
Hmm.
Now we party?